What's up, everybody? Welcome to the Good Wolf Project. I'm your host, Jerry Scarlato, and today's conversation is with Bo Bennett. Bo is an author, a speaker, an entrepreneur, and an expert in critical thinking, logical fallacies, and rationality, all of which are very important things if you want to live in today's world, because we are bombarded with so much information, quote unquote information, that it's hard to grasp onto what's true, what's false, what's real, what's wrong, and what we believe and what we don't believe. And many people are at the point where they just let, whatever information they take in do their thinking for them instead of taking the time to process it, think it through, decide if they believe what's being said or if they believe even the opinions that they have, and so that they can have their own opinions instead of just spouting other people's opinions. So that's a lot what we dig into today, understanding fallacies, understanding cognitive biases, which is just the way that we think. We think through, we think in different ways, and our biases lead us sometimes in a good path, but many times down a bad path, down a decision-making path that does not support our goals, but instead moves us in the opposite directions. And that's what we're talking about when we're talking about critical thinking. We're talking about being able to think through things and process things. That's why this topic is so important, is knowing how the brain works, knowing why it works that way. You don't need to know the structures of the brain necessarily and this, that, and the other thing, and neurons and so on and so forth. But if you understand that you are not your ideas, you are not your thinking, that's just currently the way that you think and your current ideas, then you can start to detach from them and decide if you actually want to believe what you say you believe, or if you want to believe what people are telling you to believe, which is the most important thing to think through, because the world right now is telling you to believe many things that just don't hold up, called the straw man fallacy, which we talk about actually in this episode, that they don't hold up because they don't have any backing to them. So before we get to that, I'll encourage you to hit pause real quick and either hit subscribe if you're on YouTube or give us a quick review. Remember, the more subscribers and reviews that we have, the more we reach. So I greatly appreciate you guys doing that, because we're trying to spread this message as best we can. And you are here to help by subscribing and reviewing. So thank you guys so much and appreciate you for that. So put your thinking caps on for this episode and get those pens and papers out and be ready for this conversation with Bo Bennett. Bo, great to have you on the show. My goal for today is to be able to help people to understand why it's important to think for themselves, why it's important to pay attention to the way they think, and how they can start to do that. Because it was Richard Feynman, I think, said, the goal is to not fool yourself, and you're the easiest one to fool.
Hmm.
So I think many people struggle because they just don't pay attention to their thought process. They think it's just them, and they think that they can't do a whole lot about it. But maybe they don't recognize how, their past has influenced it, or how people around them influence it, how information influences it, and so on. So I'll start with a quote that I got off of your website, and we can maybe unpack things from there. You said, expose an irrational belief, keep a person rational for a day. Expose irrational thinking, keep a person rational for a lifetime. So, what is the difference first between an irrational belief and irrational thinking?
Well, irrational belief is just one instance of the irrational thinking. The irrational thinking is the problem, like the ultimate problem, where an irrational belief is the result of that problem, is just one result of the problem. If for those of your listeners who are familiar, it's a play on the Japanese. I believe it's a Japanese proverb. Teach a man to fish, and actually, give a man a fish, feed him for a day, teach a man to fish, feed him for a lifetime. It's the same concept. We're constantly, at least those of us in the critical thinking field, if you want to call it that, are constantly trying to expose these irrational beliefs, these conspiracy theories, these whatever they may be, and we try to educate people like on why it's not true. And don't get me wrong, I think it's great, and I still do it every now and then. But it is, I wouldn't call it a waste of time, but our time could be better spent teaching people how to think critically. Once you understand what critical thinking is, how to think critically, and if it's not just something that just kicks in. I mean, it's practice, it's time. You have to want to think critically too. If you don't want to think critically, if you just want to believe what makes you feel good, then you're kind of lost, and you need to get over that. You have to want to believe what is true. I mean, that's the first step. Once you come across that, and you come across that threshold and you say, okay, yes, I understand all of the problems with believing in false things. I want to believe what's true. Then you're in a great spot, because from that point on, you start to learn and you start to practice metacognition, which is thinking about your own thinking processes. And you start to identify all of these problem areas with your thinking. And then slowly but surely, you start correcting it and you start thinking the right way. Therefore, all of these beliefs, you start like re-evaluating the beliefs that you had. Like, okay, wait a minute. I could see now how that's probably not right. That's not a correct, a true belief. So not only do you correct your erroneous beliefs that you've held for who knows how long, but you also stop believing in false things moving forward, or not in a perfect world, but you stop believing in as many, let's say. So you're definitely on the right path. So it wasn't long ago when I really would spend a lot of time just arguing and debating with people over these what I call false beliefs, or what I believe to be false beliefs. And I realized that it's just exhausting. So at one point, I just kind of gave up on that, and I said, you know what? Let's just go with the problem. Let's just try to solve the problem. And it's usually a better position for somebody who doesn't always like to be knee deep in controversy and losing friends and family over different religious or political or social issues, because I try to disassociate myself with those as much as I can and just really focus on the core of critical thinking. And then I truly do believe once you've got that straight, all of the rest will fall into place. Now, you may not have the same critical, or the religious, social, or political beliefs as I do, but the ones that you do have, if you're thinking critically, you have much better reasons for accepting those. And as you know, a lot of these beliefs, whether they be religious or political or social, a lot of them aren't always just a matter of true or false. There's a lot of like ethics involved, value system, uh, just I guess kind of like a philosophy, a way of life, and that's okay. People could have different opinions and different views on that, as long as you have good reasons for holding that. So I hope I know that was kind of long-winded, but I hope that gave you a good answer.
No, that's a good place to start. And to your point, I think so many people don't really know if they have a reason for why they believe what they believe, or what I would say religion is a big topic when it comes to they've maybe never actually thought in depth about what areas they believe, if they believe all of it, if they just haven't really thought about it at all. Politics is another one of those things. There's nutrition and health and fitness is one of those things where people just, grasp onto different ideas and topics and they become emotionally attached to them. So, you know, that's the challenge of being a human, is that you have to be able to detach from the emotion of it, if you will,
Mm.
so that you can break it apart and not allow yourself to go down that rabbit hole. Because once you start down the rabbit hole, eventually you have to turn yourself. You don't have to, but if you want to start to turn yourself around, the deeper you already are, the harder it is to turn yourself around. You got to dig out of the hole that you're in. So if you start sooner, you can dig out. You'll be able to get out sooner. Whereas if you wait, or if you're like, no, well, that can't be the case. I don't. What are you talking about? I think perfectly rationally.
All right.
Then it's going to take you. It just means that much longer that you're just reinforcing old ideas that don't support reality.
So another way that I explain exactly what you just said is instead of the rabbit hole analogy, it's basically building an ideology. So what we do is we will attach ourselves to something, whether it be a religion, a political worldview, or whatever, and we accept this label, and that becomes part of who we are. So, for example, if we're like a Buddhist, we're okay. I accept Buddhism. I am a Buddhist. I am known as a Buddhist. That becomes part of my identity. I'm not a Buddhist, by the way, but that becomes part of my identity. And then if anybody says anything negative about any aspect of Buddhism, I am personally offended by that, and I cannot address that argument or that claim rationally and without emotion, and I'm already at a major disadvantage critically thinking about it. So that's why I think it's so important for us to to try to abandon as many ideologies as possible. Like if you really want to focus on critical thinking and you want to kind of think like a scientist who's supposed to be like, I don't care what the outcome is. I just want to know what's true. Like I'm not starting with the conclusion and then trying to get the facts to support it. That's what lawyers do. Scientists work the other way. You start with the facts and you see where the conclusion leads. You may like it personally, you may not, but you have to get to the point where you say, I don't care. I mean, that's what it is, and that's all I really care about. I care about good thinking. I care about thinking critically. I care about what's true. That's my ideology. Get to that point and you're in good shape.
Yeah, and that's, what's happening in the United States right now. I don't know if this is happening worldwide necessarily. I know it's happening in other westernized countries. Grouping people together is basically how we're being pulled apart, I guess, if you'll put it that way, because people say, "Oh, I don't like this group. I don't like that group. This group is evil," and that's why if you can't look back at history and understand that that's exactly what caused many of the problems of history.
Sure.
I mean,
Yeah.
World War II is the perfect example of that. Uh, Nazi Germany, perfect example of that. If you can't understand that that's where many of those problems arose, is because you grouped the people together and because they have an ideology, you labeled the ideology, and therefore everybody in that group fulfills the ideology or fulfills that idea that they're bad because they have the ideology themselves. So what you're saying for yourself also is don't attach yourself to an ideology, because if that ideology, therefore people start attacking it, or goodness forbid it gets erased, then your identity, it becomes a struggle for you to see yourself rationally.
Sure.
So that's one of the ways that having, not basing your thinking in a rational reasoning way can be detrimental. What are some other ways that we we don't see that our irrational thinking can cause us issues?
Well, probably through cognitive biases. That's a major issue that we have, modern day humans have, because cognitive biases are basically just, I wouldn't say errors in thinking. That's what, when I speak about logical fallacies, those are errors within argumentation. Cognitive biases are more like quirks, maybe. They're not bugs in the system, they're part of the system. It allows us to operate efficiently and it allows us to really survive, and that's a good thing. However, in today's environment, when truth and logic and reason and the kind of environment that we're in, when that's really important, they tend to get in the way. So that becomes a problem. So being able to identify our own biases, knowing, basically probably starting with what cognitive biases are you aware of? Like what are some cognitive biases? And then even just like biases in general. Biases are simply when you like favor a certain point of view or whatnot. And cognitive biases, I like to define them simply as basically illusions of the mind. They make us perceive reality in a way that's not necessarily true, but may be beneficial to us personally. And again, that's the key there, because you think like, well, evolutionarily speaking, how could these things survive if they're like bad for us? Well, they're only bad for us in a modern day sense. all evolution cares about is whether we procreate and survive. That's it, or just survive long enough to procreate, and that's pretty much it. So you could see how these cognitive biases kind of stick around. So we need to be aware of them, and we need to identify them. We need to understand our own biases. And when we form an opinion, when we say something, when we see information, we have to kind of be aware of what's going on. So a good example might be if like you're watching your favorite news station that tends to agree with you politically, and when you do that, you pretty much absorb the information uncritically because you trust the news source for the most part. You like what they're saying because most likely they're trashing the other side. So it feels good. You get that rush of adrenaline. So you're just fine with it. So you don't really critically evaluate it. However, if you were to turn on the other channel and watch the news source that you're completely against, that goes against your political views, then you're extremely critical about everything they say, rightly so. It doesn't mean that everything they say is wrong, but that kind of critical thinking and critical evaluation, you should be using that for both sources. And once you realize that, then again, you're in taking a step in the right direction.
So the one that I think of and the one that I use regularly in examples is negativity bias. Speaking of evolution, evolutionarily speaking, that was a perfect. We had to have negativity bias. We had to look out for lions and tigers and bears and you know things that were going to kill us because if we didn't, then there's a good chance that we wouldn't be around. We don't have that issue today. We just have mental lions and tigers and bears that we play with all day instead, and therefore we're constantly looking for the negative in things, or we look at negative things. An example of that is if you drive by a wreck and it looks bad, you're going to look like you're going to turn and look, even though there's a good chance that you see something you don't want to see, because human beings tend to want to view negative things and we tend to view things through a negative lens. So that's something that you have to be able to pay attention to. Otherwise, you know, people say that, oh, I'm just being realistic whenever they think in a negative way, but really you're blocking off half of the potential of an outcome or an idea because you're thinking in that way.
Sure. Yeah. And realism isn't necessarily on the same scale as negative and positive. Most people think that, well, okay, you have the negative and then you have realistic in the middle and then you have positive, but it works a little bit differently. It's sort of like on a different level. And I think the best way to describe that is when you're thinking negatively about something, you're thinking about a possible outcome that may or may not occur. You essentially don't have any evidence one way or the other. It's just the way your mind goes. Same thing with the positive side. If you tend to be an optimist, you tend to think positive. What that means is in the face of zero information, given no information about the outcome, you tend to favor the possible favorable outcome. But when we're talking about with realism, we're essentially just using all the data that we have and making a statistical judgment based on the most probable outcome. So you see the difference there, like
Mhm.
with positive and negative thinking, it's like, look, I don't know which way it's going to go. There's no information to help me make a good judgment. I'm an optimistic thinker, so I'm going to go with the good. Or like you mentioned, a lot of us tend to be negative to the core, basically. So we may just kind of choose the negative option when there's no data or evidence for that whatsoever. Whereas with realism, we basically just look at the data, we look at the stats, we make the most probable outcome. We decide the most probable outcome based on that, and then we say, okay, there's nothing to worry about. For example, if we get in the plane, because the chances of us crashing are 1 in 9 million, and that's not going to happen, right? So that's realism. That's being realistic.
So it's being able to remove the label essentially and just look at things from a number standpoint almost.
Sure.
from a quantitative
Yeah,
standpoint.
more quantitative than qualitative. And I definitely consider myself an optimist. There's no doubt about that. Whether it is by nurture or nature, I mean, there certainly is a biological genetic component to our level of optimism and pessimism. Um, and then also there's a learned component. So I tend to see myself as an optimist, and I'm okay with that. And I'm also a realist. I don't say, no, I'm not an optimist. I am a realist. I say I'm both. I like to be as realistic as possible. But again, when when there's no information and I'm just thinking about the future or whatever, I look to the positive side. It makes me feel good. And I truly believe that you get better outcomes by focusing on the possibility of what's good as opposed to everything that could possibly go wrong. That's
Well,
me.
there's a lot of truth to your outer world is a reflection of your inner world, and if your inner world tends to lean toward viewing and moving toward the positive, then there's a good chance that your outer world will move in that direction as
Sure.
well. Again, most people would somehow rationalize themselves out of that in some way, shape, or form. Well, I've seen so many negative things. Oh, all these things have happened to me, and so on and so forth. Speaking of rationalizing out of things, but why do people like to rationalize?
Because we don't like to be wrong. I think that's the easiest way to put
Mm,
it. We we like when things agree with us. We don't like to be wrong. We like to be right. We like to feel good. We like that rush of adrenaline when our biases are confirmed. So if something doesn't go our way, we make up a story. We rationalize. We create a narrative to say why it went wrong. And if you think about what I just said, it sounds very much like conspiracy theory, doesn't it? It's kind of like our own personal conspiracy theory. We say, okay, well, this happened because, the girl I asked out in sixth grade, and let me be clear in this analogy, I was in sixth grade too. I'm not a 52-year-old guy asking out sixth grade girls. Just to be clear, the girl I asked out when I was in sixth grade and she said no to me. Well, that's because she hated me for something that I never said, and somebody told her something about me that wasn't true. It makes me feel better to know that rather than, hey, she just wasn't attracted to me, or she just didn't like me because she thought I was a jerk, whatever. So it's just a story we tell ourselves to feel good, and conspiracy theories are basically the group version of that.
mm.
There's stories that people tell themselves, not only to make them feel good, but also to make them feel important, that they have the answer. Everybody else is missing it. Everybody is stupid. We're all a bunch of idiots, but they're the ones. They've got the answers.
That's great. That's a great way. That's a great way to look at it. The self conspiracy theory is what rationalizing is. So you mentioned that cognitive biases is one way that we fool ourselves. How do other people? And then in the same sentence, you said something about through argumentation. There's another way for that to happen. So what's that part of it?
That's through logical fallacies. Logical fallacies are errors in our reasoning process. They're also errors within argumentation. So when we commit a logical fallacy, we are basically creating an argument that has a problem in either the structure of the argument itself. Like if you're looking at more formal argumentation, it doesn't make sense. Like logically, it does not flow. You probably heard of the non sequitur. The non sequitur is basically the most generic logical fallacy there is. And it basically says uh, the conclusion doesn't follow from the premises. And that's essentially what a logical fallacy is. And then there's a whole bunch of specific ones like, okay, why doesn't it follow? Well, it doesn't follow for this reason or that reason or that reason. And every logical fallacy has its own reason. So, and there's also like a crossover with cognitive biases. So, a lot of times people will say, well, hey, is this a logical fallacy? And it's actually more of a cognitive bias. Or sometimes a cognitive bias can also be a logical fallacy. There's a lot of overlap there. And then there's also like persuasion techniques, manipulation techniques, propaganda. All of that is sort of in the same boat, too. And it's difficult at times to draw the line, like what is what and what are the rules for it. But it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. You don't have to say, well, this is definitely a logical fallacy and this is what it's called. You just have to realize that there's a problem with the argument. There's a problem saying this is the conclusion and this is the reason why. Like if there's a problem in there, being able to point it out and you say, I can't quite put my finger on it, like what exactly is wrong, but I know something's wrong. That's a great first step. And then the next step would be, well, here's why it's wrong. And then bonus points. Here's why it's wrong because it's a straw man fallacy.
So I think this is where a lot of people get in trouble letting letting other people do thinking for them, meaning they hear someone say something and give a reason for it. And because they said something and gave a reason for it, then they believe it's real instead
Right.
of trying to parse something apart or to at least think for yourself and ask yourself if it's real or ask yourself if it makes sense. So
Right.
what's an example of that of someone saying what's a statement or something, an example of someone saying something that's a logical fallacy, so that we can maybe look at more instances of that and be able to pull them apart.
Sure. Okay. So basically, we're acting with the confirmation bias. Let's start there. The confirmation bias is when you said, like, if somebody says, like, an argument, they give a reason and they come to a conclusion, and you say, sounds great. You say sounds great because of the confirmation bias. They're saying something that you agree with. You already agree with the conclusion. So if they're giving you a reason for it, then it's good enough for you. It's like, hey, yeah, I agree with it. No questions here. I'm not going to give you trouble for it. I like what you said, so forget it. Some people do this deliberately. Some people will know that, okay, I'm ignoring the nonsense that brought them to this conclusion. They're saying the conclusion that I like, so it's good enough for me. But most people, I would say, most people are really more honest, and they're just not seeing it. They're not thinking critically, and they accept the conclusion that somebody may have given. So I mentioned the straw man fallacy, or a straw man argument. It could go either way. That's basically when, let's say, somebody says, uh, "Okay, well, the Earth is round," and then somebody says, "Well, no, the I think the Earth is flat." Say, "Okay, well, why do you think the Earth is flat?" And then they start to go off on this huge tangent about how the government is corrupt and you can't trust the government. And they give examples of, like, in 1958, the government hid this information, and they say nothing about, like, the science of the Earth being flat, but they give a bunch of reasons and they say, and therefore the Earth is round. I mean, that's the kind of argument where they're not giving the right information. They're not supporting the argument with the information that they should, the evidence that they should. The evidence doesn't match. Um, so I mean, that's one example that where you have a logical fallacy combined with a cognitive bias.
Yeah, and I've heard where the name why it was called the straw man fallacy. It's something to the effect that it just because
It's
because
easier
it's
to knock down.
there
So
you
yeah,
go.
because like a straw man is, like, made of straw, so you could push it down. So for
There you go.
example, like if the flat earther couldn't provide any facts, like any good facts about what's going on, they're just going to give you facts about the government being corrupt or secretive because that's what governments do. So that's much easier to defend. It's a much easier argument to make than the science of the earth being flat. So that's where they go on that tangent.
Yeah, and that's I think a lot of people it's just it's easy to fall for that because you can hear someone explain something, especially something that if they sound smart or they're an expert or they have some
Yeah,
title to them or something to that effect, that makes it even more that makes it even harder for somebody to pull it apart because they're appealing to the authority of the person.
sure.
That's one way that people will pull us around through authority, through emotion and other things. How do people use things like authority and emotion to help us, or not help us, but to get us to believe kind of their
and
point of
deceive
view?
us.
Yep.
Yeah, there's something called the argument from authority. And this is always a tricky one because you can't possibly know everything about everything. Like very smart people have to rely on authorities. That's what we do. And especially in science, there are people, for example, like that study viruses their entire careers. They spend dozens of years studying viruses. So they're called virologists. So when you want to know about a virus or something, those are the people that we should be turning to for the information. Now, here's the problem. When you say, and let me back up a step and say that virologists know more about viruses than anybody, right? I mean, I think that's a pretty rational statement to make and a pretty good stereotype that because that's what they do. But let's also remember that in the scientific community, there's not always like a 100% agreement on everything. That's never going to happen. So let's say we have a pool of 1,000 different virologists, and then they're asked their opinion, say like on COVID or something. And then you have maybe 980 virologists. They all give one opinion, but then you have the 20 outliers who give another opinion. And they're all still very qualified. They're not crackheads. They're not kooks. They're just they just have different opinions. They come to different conclusions for whatever reason. Maybe some personal biases involved, or maybe they have different data. Maybe they didn't see all the data. It doesn't matter. The point is that we can look as non-virologists, as people who are interested in finding out the truth about some kind of viral question, we could look at the pool of data. We could look at everything as a whole, like what do virologists in total come up with? Like what did they say about this certain thing? And we could say, okay, when we look at the certain studies that compile like many hundreds of different studies, then they come to the conclusion that X is true. That's what we mean by relying on authority. That's the correct way. That's the critical thinking way of relying on authority by looking at the pool of data of experts who are truly experts. They're not just opinions. The science is a little bit different when we come to like historical or especially like politics. So that is good. What we can't do is we can't take any one of those virologists, especially one of the 20 who came up with the very different idea, and say, well, see, this guy is very smart. He says this, therefore that is true. Because we're saying they're right because it's them. Whereas in the other scenario where we're doing the critical thinking, we're not saying they're right because they're smart. We're saying they're right because here's the pool of data and the science and all of the information that they've gathered over however long they've compiled, and this is what the data says. They're just the ones who are kind of explaining it to us. So that's the difference between the fallacy of the authority versus the good critical thinking skill of relying on an authority.
So it's being able to look at the whole circle, the whole pie, instead of just a sliver of the pie, instead of just grabbing one individual and going, hey, this person happens to believe XYZ, which again, COVID is the perfect example of this because in any belief of COVID, you could have found an expert that believed anything that you wanted to believe about COVID,
Right,
probably.
right, right.
So it very easily turned into just this catastrophe of information because everyone's going, well, no, this expert said that and that expert said this. So being able to, and I don't think people have the patience or wherewithal to understand scientific studies, which is maybe partly why they don't do it, because to look at a meta-analysis and be able to at least parse it apart to go, okay, I can see where these people came up with this information. But I think also that's something that if you want to be able to get to conclusions that are more rational, that's something that you want to be able to develop, to be able to look at that kind of information and parse it apart and know what it means.
Right.
So
Right.
outside of authority, emotion is another one. Human beings are emotional beings, and the number of emotional topics that the world is filled with right now is
Countless.
infinite. Yes, it
It's
is
always been.
crazy. I'll give you an example, and then I'll ask you the question. So I saw a poll last week. Donald Trump had the idea to take federal taxes off of tips, and they did a poll where they mentioned his name and didn't mention his name, and asked if people agreed with the idea. 62% of people agreed when his name was mentioned. 68% agreed when his name was not mentioned. So that means there's 10% of people in there that are making a decision because of a name and because of the feelings that they attach to the name. So that's just an example of how our emotions make us make that's an irrational decision, in my opinion, because if you're making a decision that is taking more money away from you, regardless of what you feel about the person, that's an irrational decision. Now, if money's not important to you, that's fine, and you want to have
Sure.
different. Yeah, I mean, we're all individuals. So how else do people appeal to our emotion to again pull us in the direction they want us to go?
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring up that example because one of the areas that I studied is the survey analysis. Basically, it's the creation of a survey and realizing like every single word is extremely important. The order of the words, like it's so easy to bias the answer to get the answer that you want by wording something in a certain way. And even like by asking the question in a certain way in order to, as you suggest, triggering somebody's emotional response as opposed to their more logical response. Like you can, if you ask somebody a question in a certain state, like by preferencing it with a story or telling them something, then asking them a sort of related question, you could get a completely different answer by basically anchoring some data to their state of mind, like their current state of mind, and now they're thinking about something, and now they're going to say something like completely different. Um, and your example was interesting too, with just throwing the name in there. Donald Trump says this versus it's funny too. A lot of the you see some of these videos on YouTube. Or I think it was done on Jimmy Kimmel or something. I don't know. I don't remember. But the point was they they said, like, your political candidate says this, and this. What do you think about that? And they said, oh, I think it's a brilliant idea. I think it's the most. And that was, oh, wait a minute, wait a minute. No, that was the other guy. And then they're like, oh, no,
Mhm.
well, and they completely changed their story.
Yeah,
Like, they said this is the stupidest idea ever. It is hilarious, like when you watch it, because you think, what's going on here? Are people really this stupid? Are they like this much of like a puppet where they could so easily be manipulated just by these ideas, these names? But yeah, I mean, it happens. And of course, with the when people show things on YouTube like that, or even when Jimmy Kimmel or whoever the other guys, whenever they go out and do these interviews, they only show you like the best of the best. They don't do all the
right.
other people who say, "No, I still believe that." Yeah, even though it is the other guy, I still believe that. There's probably other people that do say that, but it's for entertainment purposes. But that's still a very important, very important point. Realize the selection bias. A lot of the things we see on YouTube and on the internet and Facebook and social media is carefully curated and highly edited to get like a certain message across. And it could be completely wrong and giving the completely wrong message. We need to realize that. I think that's extremely important. And going on this rant, I completely forgot the question that you asked me. I apologize.
Oh, that's all good. No, that was a good rant. Selection bias,
Okay.
and I would say confirmation bias on top of that when it comes to social media. The
Yeah.
the the content itself is developed in a specific way, but also you are fed the content in a specific way to confirm your current beliefs, essentially. Also, to just grab your attention and feed your monkey brain to no end. That's another reason another reason they feed you a lot of the content. But yes, the emotional appeal is what we were is what we were talking about, and how our because we're emotional beings, we tend to make decisions emotionally instead of rationally.
Rationally. Okay. Yeah. So there's something I could definitely say about that as well. I taught public speaking for a while. I did do a lot of public speaking. And a big question that a lot of people have is about the emotional appeal, the emotional element, because there seems to be a contradiction within logical fallacies, within critical thinking, within reason. There's something called the emotional appeal, which is bad. And you don't want to appeal to people's emotions. Whereas in public speaking, you definitely want to appeal to people's emotions. What's going on? Is public speaking manipulation or and the answer is no. The answer is the emotional appeal is fallacious when you use that in place of logic, in place of reason, when you just try to appeal to people's emotion, and when the facts and the logic are actually counter to that. Whereas within a good speech, like good public speaking, what you want to do is you want to hit them with the facts. You want to hit them with the reason, and you want to give them a good emotional reason to accept that information as well. So you're supporting the facts and the reason with emotion. And that is wonderful. I think any good communicator will use that, as opposed to just like showing somebody a picture of like a fetus and saying abortion bad, look at that. And that's like, oh yeah, that's horrible, abortion bad. I mean, that's pure emotional appeal. Like if you want to tell me abortion is bad, tell me why. Give me the reasons, give me the facts, and go ahead and show me the picture of the it was funny. They showed one time. They showed a picture of a dolphin baby or something, and you say like, look at this, would you ever, this is like an adorable human, isn't it? He's like, yeah, definitely. No, it's not. It's a it's a
Wrong.
dolphin. But, but the point being, it's extremely important to use emotion and use logic and reason as well. The emotion is there to support the logic and reason, not replace it.
So you're not driving your what you're trying to persuade people to through emotion only.
Well, yeah, only. I would add
Yes.
that. And I would say like I probably wouldn't even have a problem with driving your message with emotion as long as it's supported by the facts. I'm okay with that. It's not the kind of communication style that I prefer. I can deal with my own emotion. I want to know like the facts. However, I see the power in that because as you mentioned, we are like first and foremost emotional creatures, and then well, with the exception of 5% of us who are sociopaths, and the possible 1 to 2% who are psychopaths, they don't have that emotion. They don't have that level of empathy, so that it doesn't work for them, which is a whole interesting discussion on its own. But the empathy and the emotion, it's on a bell curve. Like you're familiar with the bell curve. Most of us are like in the middle there, where some of us are more emotional and empathetic than others, but there are people on the edges, just specifically on the one edge that where you just don't have it. You don't have that same level of emotion or the level of empathy, and those are the people who are typically classified as sociopaths. And that's not always a bad thing. There are a lot of sociopaths that are completely functional and live purely like great ethical lives as well, because they understand the transactional element of of living, um, like with other people, like the social contract, basically. But it's more of a rarity than more of a commonality with sociopaths and psychopaths. Psychopaths have that dark element to them, the violent element, in addition to the lack of empathy, where that's where you see like the murders and all that really, really dark stuff.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's I think of bats whenever I think about that, because bats apparently if a bat goes out and they didn't get enough food, then they will help other bats or something like that.
Mm,
And if you happen to not help other bats, then the bats will basically turn their back on you.
yeah.
Now, bats aren't emotional. It's not like they're pissed at that guy, like screw that guy. We're going to turn our backs on this guy. They know through social contract that this is what we do, and if you don't follow the rules, then here's what's going to happen. And that's what you're talking about with a sociopath is that, because
Yeah.
that sociopath, they understand that I need to be able to fit in society, and here's what I need to be able to do to fit in society.
Right. Right. And if
So
you don't, you're in trouble.
yeah, no, I mean it's super interesting. But so what are some things that we can do to then start to pay attention to our own thinking so that we can maybe start to change things? Not maybe, hopefully start to change things. Because again, I just think many people let the news or social media or their friends do their thinking for them. They don't they wouldn't say it that way, but many people just regurgitate what they hear instead of process what they hear, or
Yeah.
they just don't take the time to think things through.
Right.
So what can we start to do?
Well, the first thing is you have to ask yourself the question, do I really care about what's true or not? And it may seem so obvious, like, of course I do. Of course I do. But maybe you don't. And maybe you like to hear things that confirm what you already believe. Maybe you like to believe things because it makes you feel good. Um, I don't want to get into religion too much, but a key component where people stick with religions, and we know this from studies that have been done with pastors who devote their lives to like say the Christian faith, and then they become like, oh, I don't believe in God anymore, now what? But they still kind of go through the motions because of that social pressure, like their whole lives or all their study, their jobs, their family, their circles. Like you can't abandon that, because if you do, it'll turn your life upside down. And that's what we call motivated reasoning. Like you're really motivated to believe something, so you sort of compartmentalize that idea and you say, okay, I'm going to use critical thinking except for that. I'm not going to touch that. I don't want to know. I'm happy knowing, I'm happy believing in this. So if you have evidence or any facts or anything, I don't want to hear it. And that's actually a far more common than many people believe, and not just with religion, but with you could just pick anything. We have reasons that we want to believe certain things, and we're highly motivated to believe those things. So that gets in the way. We have to have like the courage and the faith in ourselves to know, okay, maybe my life is going to be turned upside down a bit. Maybe things, I may lose some friends. Maybe I'm going to have some rough relationships with family members, but I'm committing to myself. Well, first, the faith part in myself is knowing that everything will be okay. I'm confident in my abilities, my communication abilities, my ability to with relationships in order to straighten all this out, to find another job, to do whatever. So that's good. Again, that's where some of the optimism comes in versus the pessimism. So making that decision, saying, I want to know what's true, and that's where you need to start. Now, once you do that, once you're willing to take that step, then it's a matter of kind of reevaluating your your existing ideas. But maybe I'm jumping ahead a little bit, because before you reevaluate, you kind of need to know some of the core components of critical thinking. And we mentioned a bunch of them already. I mean, I think this show that we did was a great primer on critical thinking in general. We're talking about cognitive biases. Like, what are they? How many are there? Where can I find out more about them? Logical fallacies, same thing. Which, by the way, my books will cover all of those. Some of the critical thinking, manipulation techniques, persuasion techniques, communication techniques in general. If you have a good like introduction of a lot of these, then armed with that information, then you could start going back and thinking about some of your core beliefs and kind of reevaluating them, see if they still hold up to this kind of scrutiny. So like that's incredibly important. And if you do that, you're off to a really good start.
Yeah, it like you said, it's a deep well, and it starts with beginning to challenge it, really.
Yeah.
And if you challenge, if you're willing to challenge one idea, then there's a good chance that you're willing to challenge more. And, this isn't, I think a lot of people will look at it as a challenging themselves kind of thing, meaning putting themselves down, going back to the identity crisis we kind of talked about in the beginning with ideologies and so on and so forth. So there, you got to be able to set that aside and recognize that your ideas are not you. They're just the ideas you have. They're just the beliefs that you have. It's just the current thinking that you currently have. If you're going to have the courage, I like the courage and the faith to be able to dive into this.
Yeah. And when we talked about ideology, again, if you want to, if you really want to focus on like, okay, I want something that defines me. Like, what kind of person am I want to be part of a group. Be part of the group that cares about what's true. Be a good critical thinker. That's who you are. Define yourself as that. With that, you can choose anything and any religion, any political view, any social issue, and you could switch if the data comes up and the information and the evidence comes up against what you believe. It doesn't matter because the kind of person you are is the kind of person that follows the evidence, that follows the facts. And once you do that, then it doesn't matter. So I also I'm always tempted to throw in the other tip, like the idea of try to get rid of your ideologies. Like, do you feel extremely strong about anything, like a religious position, a political position, a social issue? And if you do, try to look at the other side. But I think that that's actually a that will come as a result of good critical thinking. I think that over time, you will find your really strong positions starting to get a little less strong because you start to see the other side and you start to see the evidence and the arguments and say, oh, that's a good point. I mean, personally, I definitely, there was a lot of issues that I was always like really strong about, felt strongly about. And then you start to hear the arguments and say, oh, I could see that. I could totally understand that. I could empathize with that. I still don't agree with it, but I'm not the kind of person that would be on, picketing or tent out or join a protest or anything like that because I there's no way I feel strongly enough about that issue given that I know the facts from both sides and I could easily see how people on both sides could empathize, or I could empathize with people on both sides. And when you're in that mindset, another huge benefit besides most likely being right, like having the position that's most likely true, you're able to communicate much more effectively with people on both sides. And you're able to persuade better because you understand where they're coming from. You've got that level of empathy. You could empathize with them and you could address those concerns more clearly, and you're not seen as like a hostile, oh, you're on the other side. So there's so many benefits to it. But again, I don't think it's necessary to look at all your really strong opinions and try to start seeing the other side. I think that will ultimately come in the process of just evaluating all your opinions in general.
Mm, I love that. Bo, appreciate you so much. You mentioned your books. Where can people find you and where can people find your book? Because I saw all like 75 of them that you've written, which is which is pretty incredible.
Well, in fairness, I've manually written probably like a little less than 20. Some books are fairly small. I usually say I've written over a dozen books because there are over a dozen like nice thick ones that took a long time. And then because I'm in the publishing industry and I'm also in artificial intelligence, I use artificial intelligence to publish books. So that's why I have like probably under 100 under my name. But you're not going to find those on my website. On my website, you'll find the ones that I've written. specifically about critical thinking and about psychology, um, and then just some other issues generally based in science. And that's at bobennett.com, BOBENNETT.com.
Very good. I'll make sure to put that in the description. Anywhere else people can find you? You on the social webs anywhere else?
Not really. I don't post socially much anymore. I have a Facebook site, but I really don't use that.
Mhm.
Bobennett.com. And then if you want to find out about my businesses, what I do, archieboy.com. That's where you can find all my information about business.
Well, good for you for staying detached, man. That's tough in this society, in the world we live in. But good for you.
Yeah. Well, I still consume it.
Yeah.
A lot of friends on Facebook, and I'm what you call the lurker,
Oh, there you
but
go.
I don't just do much posting.
Well, good. I'll make sure to put all that in the description. Bo, I appreciate your information. I appreciate your knowledge. Appreciate your wisdom so much. Thanks for all the good tips.
Thank
Thanks
you.
for coming on, brother.
Thank you.